remember hearing the first shot. When I turn the light on and I see that he's shot, it shocks you. Here is the person I love. He's dying.
From the outside, Joan Shannon and Army Major David Shannon embodied the image of a typical disciplined military family. David, a well-respected officer, and Joan, the mother of 2 young sons and 2 older daughters, seemed to live an ordinary, structured life. But appearances can be deceiving, and beneath the facade of normalcy lay a family entangled in secrets. Dark, twisted secrets that were about to unravel in the most horrifying way imaginable. But before we dive deeper into the mystery, I'd like to ask for a small favor. The statistics show that more than 70% of you watching aren't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into true crime and want to stay updated on future cases, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and ensures you don't miss out on any new videos. Now, without further ado, let's get back to the case. Joan's past was fraught with trauma. Abandoned by her parents as a young girl, Joan had spent her formative years in foster care, a wound that shaped her deeply. She carried this abandonment with her into adulthood, a shadow that seemed to affect every decision she made. After several failed, abusive relationships, she found herself with David Shannon, a man who, on the surface, seemed to offer the stability she had always craved. But the foundations of their relationship were anything but stable. What seemed like a respectable family by day was far more complicated behind closed doors. At night, Joan and David indulged in a lifestyle that many would consider scandalous. Extramarital affairs, sexual experimentation, and involvement in a local swingers club known as the Fayetteville Gang Bangers. The juxtaposition of David's image as a stoic military man with the reality of his private life was striking. Yet, even this secretive lifestyle didn't remain purely physical. As Joan's affair with Jeffrey Wilson, a fellow soldier from the swingers circle, deepened, it became more than a casual fling. It was an emotional escape, and one that would ultimately light the fuse to their household's destruction. The Shannon household was anything but peaceful. While Joan's life spiraled out of control due to her personal choices, her teenage daughter, Elizabeth, had her own set of troubles. Born into a chaotic family situation, Elizabeth's formative years were marred by abuse, neglect, and a constant sense of instability. By the time she entered her teens, she had become a rebellious force, seemingly determined to wreak havoc wherever she went. Expelled from school for fighting, Elizabeth's behavior reflected her growing frustration with her circumstances. She and her sister Daisy became infamous in their neighborhood for hosting wild parties while their parents were away, solidifying their reputation as uncontrollable, troubled teens. But Elizabeth's rebellion wasn't just about teenage angst. It was the manifestation of deeper issues. The relationship between her and Joan was strained at best, and David's attempts to establish authority in the household were met with resistance. Friends and neighbors noted the chaos that seemed to emanate from the Shannon home. David's sister later remarked that the girls broke every rule he set, making any semblance of discipline impossible to maintain. It was clear that the household was a powder keg, just waiting for a spark. David Shannon himself was far from oblivious to the brewing storm. He began to grow increasingly concerned about Joan's relationship with Jeffrey Wilson. What had started as a mutual agreement to engage in extramarital activities within the confines of their swinger lifestyle was now turning into something far more threatening. Joan's emotional attachment to Jeffrey had crossed a line that David couldn't ignore. The boundaries they had set for their marriage, boundaries that had already been blurred, were now being violated by Joan's deepening feelings for Wilson. Tension mounted as jealousy and suspicion began to creep into David's mind. And then came the desperation. Joan, juggling the discontent in her marriage, her troubled relationship with her daughters, and her emotional affair, found herself backed into a corner. The once structured life she had shared with David was crumbling. Her yearning to be with Jeffrey without the constraints of her marriage grew stronger each day, and with that desire, an unimaginable idea began to take shape. What if David wasn't in the picture anymore? In this growing storm of dysfunction, resentment, and emotional turmoil, Joan Shannon made a decision that would lead her down a path from which there would be no return. What she chose next would forever alter her family's future and bring a deadly end to the seemingly ordinary life they had worked so hard to maintain. Now, before we continue, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you enjoy uncovering the darkest secrets behind seemingly perfect relationships, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep bringing you these stories, where passion and betrayal lead to deadly outcomes. That being said, let's get back to the case. In the early morning hours of July 23, 2002, a chilling phone call pierced the silence of Fayetteville's emergency dispatch center. Joan Shannon, her voice trembling but composed, reported a terrifying scene. "Someone's broken in. They've shot my husband." It was around 3:30 a.m., and Joan insisted that she had been startled awake by the sharp, deafening sound of gunfire. As her eyes fluttered open in confusion, she claimed to see a shadowy figure standing over her husband's body, his lifeless form still lying next to her in their bed. Before she could comprehend the horror, the figure reportedly fled into the night, leaving behind the aftermath of a brutal murder. The urgency in her voice had police and paramedics rushing to the Shannon residence. When the first responders arrived at the scene, they were met by Joan, standing outside in the cool darkness. Strangely, despite the violence that had just transpired, Joan's demeanor didn't quite match the typical hysteria of a grieving spouse. While she displayed signs of distress, it wasn't the overwhelming state of shock or panic one would expect. Something felt off. Inside the house, the scene was nothing short of horrific. David Shannon lay dead in the couple's bed, naked, with 2 fatal gunshot wounds, one to his head and another to his chest. Blood splattered the bedroom walls, and the sheets were soaked through with it. The violence of the attack was undeniable, yet one unsettling question hung in the air. How had Joan escaped this bloodbath unscathed? Despite claiming to have been asleep right beside him, there wasn't a single drop of blood on her. The investigation began immediately. Police combed through the house, and what they found only deepened their suspicions. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no jimmied locks. Nothing appeared to be stolen or even disturbed. How had someone entered and left the house so quietly? And how had they done so without alerting anyone in a house full of people? Joan wasn't alone that night. Her 2 young sons were fast asleep in their rooms, blissfully unaware of the horror unfolding just steps away. Elizabeth Shannon, Joan's 15-year-old daughter, was also in the house, along with her friend, Vera Thompson, who had spent the night. The 2 girls claimed they were listening to music in another room during the murder. A house full of people, yet no one had seen or heard anything except Joan. Suspicion began to swirl around her like a storm. As detectives interviewed Joan, something about her story began to fray at the edges. Her behavior was odd, too composed, too measured. While she maintained that she had been asleep next to David when the shots were fired, there was one glaring problem. She had no blood on her. The forensic evidence didn't align with her claims. How could she have been so close, yet so untouched by the violence? Then came the most shocking discovery of all. During their search of the house, police stumbled upon a hidden stash of explicit material: pornographic magazines, videotapes, and photographs, all tucked away under the very bed David had been killed in. These weren't just any materials. They featured Joan, David, and Jeffrey Wilson, a soldier the couple had met through a local swingers club. The images depicted them engaging in sexual activities, raising immediate questions about the nature of the couple's relationship and their involvement with Wilson. The revelation of this secret sexual lifestyle shifted the investigation into a new direction. Was David's murder a random act of violence, or had it been driven by something much darker, something tied to Joan's affair with Wilson and the couple's secret life? As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, it became clear that this case was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. What had seemed like a tragic home invasion was beginning to look like something much more sinister. From the moment investigators arrived, something didn't add up. Joan Shannon's story of an intruder creeping into the house, killing her husband in cold blood, and slipping away undetected seemed far-fetched. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of theft. Nothing that indicated a break-in had taken place. It was as though the intruder had vanished into thin air. But it wasn't just the lack of evidence that troubled the detectives. It was Joan herself. Despite claiming to have woken up to find her husband murdered right beside her, Joan's behavior was far from what they expected. She showed little emotion, and her story remained strangely detached. More troubling was the fact that she had no blood on her. Given the brutal and close-range nature of the shooting, anyone nearby would have been splattered with blood, especially if they were lying next to the victim. This raised a crucial question. Was Joan hiding something? The investigation's first major break came from the forensic tests. Joan, Elizabeth, and Vera Thompson were all tested for gunshot residue to determine if they had fired the weapon that killed David Shannon. When the results came in, it became clear that something sinister was brewing. Joan tested positive for gunshot residue, but here's the twist. The pattern suggested that she wasn't the one who pulled the trigger herself. Elizabeth and Vera, however, tested completely clean. This critical piece of evidence sent the investigation in a new direction. If Joan didn't fire the gun, why did she have residue on her hands? Was she involved, but in a different way? As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered another shocking revelation. Joan Shannon had been having an affair with Jeffrey Wilson, a man they had met through the local swingers scene. What had initially started as a purely physical arrangement between Joan, David, and other participants began to spiral out of control. Joan developed feelings for Wilson, feelings that went beyond the confines of their unconventional lifestyle. David Shannon had grown uneasy with how close Joan and Wilson were becoming. The boundaries that they had set for their open relationship were crumbling, and the cracks were starting to show. Wilson himself, when interviewed by detectives, painted an opportunistic picture. He revealed that while Joan had developed feelings for him, he had no intention of reciprocating. To Wilson, this was simply a way to manipulate Joan into doing what he wanted. He admitted that he had been stringing her along, feeding her lies about his feelings, so she would co-sign for a motorcycle he wanted to purchase. Wilson's self-serving confession ruled him out as a suspect, but his affair with Joan added another layer of complexity to the case. The investigation took a dramatic turn when an anonymous tip reached the police, claiming that Elizabeth Shannon, Joan's 15-year-old daughter, was the actual shooter. This information set off a new chain of events that revealed just how tangled this web of deceit truly was. Was Joan the mastermind, or had Elizabeth acted on her own? Investigators were determined to find out. Vera Thompson, Elizabeth's friend who had been at the house the night of the murder, was brought in for questioning once again. Under mounting pressure, Vera cracked. She revealed the chilling truth. Joan had instructed Elizabeth to kill David. According to Vera, Joan had meticulously plotted the murder, manipulating her teenage daughter into carrying out the violent act. Joan had told Elizabeth to put on surgical gloves and dark clothing, sneak into her stepfather's bedroom, and pull the trigger. Elizabeth, under her mother's influence, did as she was told. One shot to the head, then another to the chest to make sure David was dead. Soon after, Elizabeth's confession followed. She admitted that it was she who had pulled the trigger, taking her stepfather's life. But her confession didn't stop there. Elizabeth's account was clear and damning. She had acted under the explicit command of her mother, Joan Shannon. For months, Joan had been planting the seeds, painting David as an obstacle to their future happiness, an impediment to the life they could have without him. Joan wanted him gone, and Elizabeth, craving her mother's approval and seemingly unable to escape her influence, finally succumbed to Joan's manipulations. Elizabeth revealed that Joan had orchestrated the entire plot. According to her, Joan had spent weeks pressuring her daughter, building up the narrative that David was a threat to their happiness, and presenting murder as the only solution. Joan made it clear that they couldn't move forward unless David was out of the picture, permanently. The motive behind Joan's actions? David's $700,000 life insurance policy. Joan, desperate for a fresh start with Jeffrey Wilson, believed that this windfall would free her from the constraints of her failing marriage and allow her to begin a new life. On the night of the murder, Joan had carefully instructed Elizabeth on what to do. She had laid out every detail: the surgical gloves, the dark clothes, the precise moment to act. Elizabeth entered her stepfather's room, where he lay sleeping, and fired the first shot into his head. When he didn't die instantly, Joan urged her to fire again, this time into his chest. The second shot sealed David's fate. It was a gruesome, calculated execution, orchestrated by a mother who had manipulated her own child to do her bidding. With Elizabeth's confession and Vera Thompson's corroborating testimony, the police had more than enough evidence to arrest Joan Shannon. On July 30th, 2002, just a week after the murder, Joan was taken into custody. She was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory after the fact. The web of lies and manipulation that Joan had spun had finally unraveled. But there was one more twist. Elizabeth, consumed by guilt and fear, had fled. She was found hiding under a friend's bed in a trailer park several days later. The frightened teenager, who had been thrust into this horrific situation by her mother, was arrested without incident. As the full extent of Joan's manipulation came to light, the case against her grew even stronger. Elizabeth's confession had not only solidified the murder charges against her mother, but it also exposed the dark and twisted relationship between Joan and her daughter, one where Joan's relentless manipulation and greed had pushed a teenager to commit murder in a desperate bid to please her mother and escape a life that Joan had convinced her was unsalvageable without bloodshed. Both Joan Shannon and her daughter Elizabeth were then immediately arrested and charged with the murder of Army Major David Shannon. Elizabeth, who had confessed to the crime, claimed that her mother had manipulated her into committing the murder. This confession became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case against Joan. The trial was set to determine not just who pulled the trigger, but who was ultimately responsible for orchestrating the murder. Elizabeth Shannon agreed to testify against her mother in exchange for a reduced sentence. In her testimony, she painted a picture of a manipulative and controlling Joan Shannon, who had pressured her daughter into committing the unthinkable. According to Elizabeth, Joan had told her that David was an obstacle to their happiness, and that his death was the only way for them to secure a better life. Joan's goal, Elizabeth said, was to claim David's life insurance policy, which amounted to $700,000, and use the money to start a new life with her lover, Jeffrey Wilson. The prosecution argued that Joan Shannon had been the mastermind behind the entire plot. They presented evidence showing that Joan had initially asked Elizabeth to hire a hitman, but when that plan failed, Joan convinced Elizabeth to carry out the murder herself. The forensic evidence, including Joan's positive test for gunshot residue, supported the theory that Joan had been involved in the crime, even if she hadn't pulled the trigger. Additionally, the discovery of the family's secret life, including their involvement in the local swingers scene and Joan's affair with Wilson, provided a motive for the murder. Elizabeth's testimony was damning. She described in detail how Joan had walked her through the plan, instructing her to put on surgical gloves and dark clothing before entering David's bedroom. Elizabeth told the court that after shooting her stepfather once in the head, she had hesitated, but Joan had urged her to fire again, ensuring David's death. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of a mother who had manipulated her teenage daughter into committing murder for her own gain. On the defense side, Joan Shannon maintained her innocence. She refused to testify in her own defense, but her legal team argued that Elizabeth had acted on her own, and that Joan had no knowledge of the murder plot. They suggested that Elizabeth, who had a history of behavioral problems and rebellion, had killed her stepfather out of her own anger and resentment. Joan's defense team attempted to shift the blame onto Elizabeth, portraying her as a troubled teenager who had lashed out violently. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury was unconvinced. After a month-long trial, Joan Shannon was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, and accessory after-the-fact to murder. The court sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Elizabeth Shannon, having cooperated with the prosecution, was sentenced to 25 to 31 years in prison for second-degree murder. She received a lighter sentence in exchange for her testimony against her mother, but her time in prison has been marked by numerous infractions, indicating ongoing behavioral issues. She is eligible for release in 2029. The trial tore the Shannon family apart. Joan's supporters, including David Shannon's family, believed that Elizabeth had acted alone and that Joan had been wrongfully convicted. Others, however, believed that Joan Shannon was indeed the mastermind behind the crime. Prosecutors had presented a compelling case, highlighting Joan's clear financial motive, her desire to collect the $700,000 life insurance policy on David Shannon. Furthermore, Joan's affair with Jeffrey Wilson, her growing emotional attachment to him, and her dissatisfaction with her marriage were key elements of the prosecution's narrative. This led many to conclude that Joan had manipulated her daughter into carrying out the murder. The trial also revealed deep fractures within the Shannon family. David's family remained divided on the issue. Some of them continued to support Joan, maintaining her innocence and blaming Elizabeth for the murder. In their eyes, Elizabeth was the real culprit, a troubled and rebellious teenager who had acted out of her own issues rather than under her mother's influence. David's sister-in-law described Elizabeth as a vindictive and evil child, further emphasizing the division within the family. However, others could not ignore the powerful evidence against Joan. The manipulation of a vulnerable teenager into committing murder, combined with the overwhelming financial and emotional motives, painted a chilling picture of Joan Shannon. Her refusal to testify in her own defense further strengthened the belief that she was the driving force behind the crime. Joan's sentencing marked the end of a deeply tragic chapter in the lives of all involved. While she would spend the rest of her life in prison, Elizabeth's future also remained uncertain. With her incarceration stretching into her adulthood, Elizabeth's time behind bars has been marred by disciplinary issues. Since being sentenced, she has accumulated numerous infractions for theft, fighting, and engaging in inappropriate sexual acts within the prison system. Despite her cooperation with the prosecution, Elizabeth's troubled past continued to haunt her, making her future post-incarceration uncertain. The tragic case of Joan and Elizabeth Shannon leaves us with many unsettling questions about the depths of manipulation and betrayal within a family. How far would someone go for love? And what happens when that love turns toxic, entangling those closest to us in unimaginable ways? Do you think Joan masterminded this crime, or was Elizabeth ultimately responsible for the tragic end of her stepfather's life? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take on this chilling story. And if you're fascinated by the dark twists and turns of true crime, be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on more stories where hidden motives lead to devastating consequences. Hit the notification bell so you're the first to know when new cases drop.